A lot of the getting things done or GTD methodology for personal productivity is really based on common sense, or at least first principles. And as a result, it's conceptually pretty easy to grasp. And therefore, as a practice, it's a lot more about behavior change over time. That said, there is one way in which the methodology kind of contravenes traditional schooling about how we're supposed to think about things, but in fact is a lot more natural to how our brains really work. I'm talking about the difference between thinking categorically and contextually. And in this video, if you've been struggling at all with what kind of lists you should be maintaining to support yourself and staying productive in difficult times, this one's for you. Poet Wallace Stevens said, "Conceptions are artificial, perceptions are essential." He was talking about poetry, but he could just as easily be talking about how our brains relate to all the stuff we have to get done in our lives. We often are trained that we should be thinking categorically, but these categories are often somewhat arbitrary or conceptual, right? This goes in the red bucket, that goes in the blue bucket. Now, labeling things is a little bit different. When you want to label something for reference, you want the meaning to match the location. And so when you stick a label onto something, what we recommend is that you cast your mind forward to your future self. What are you going to be thinking about? How are you going to be thinking about this particular thing when you want to get it back? And that's just how you label it and how you put it in, right? So it's just a pointer. It's just a reference into how you're going to find the thing you need to find. But when it comes time to wrangle all your commitments, which is what so many of us that are making to-do lists and using or perhaps overusing the calendar to try and organize ourselves to accomplish, your future self really wants to get stuff done. And it doesn't really care if it falls into the red bucket or the blue bucket. More than anything, your future self and your brain in the moment wants to know what's possible. What can I get stuck in with and get into motion with? One of the biggest places this shows up is in the kind of anxiety or concern people often express when they're first learning GTD and they discover that a lot of these list-keeping tools, the digital tools, don't allow you to link the projects and actions in a kind of software way that allows you to sort of see actions by project. And the reason for that is they are thinking of projects in a very categorical way. And you can see this by the way that they label their projects. They call it Project KMX or Project Merger or Finance. And again, these aren't projects in the way that we think of them because projects aren't categories. Projects are finish lines. Projects are completed states that you are moving toward and eventually going to achieve. So sometimes actions also sort of encapsulate that done state because the action will be done just sort of in one. You'll sit down, you'll do the thing, and that's job done. Whereas projects, of course, represent an end state when there's going to be multiple steps along the way. That's kind of our definition in GTD of projects. So contexts come in to help you understand what you can do when. Rather than looking at categories, which are really, again, just buckets that may or may not represent what's actually possible to you in the moment, options are highly practical, where categories are, again, conceptual and therefore necessarily artificial. So this is where I think a lot of our traditional academic schooling may have kind of failed us, because in that model, we're making up systems. We're creating systems of how things ought to work and how we ought to work and trying to sort of shoehorn ourselves into these systems, these artificial, frankly, conceptual systems that we invented in order to try and motivate ourselves. And the reality is it's much easier to acknowledge how your brain actually wants to work. And from that basis, move forward with giving it the options it needs to make good choices in the moment. One of the most striking stories I recall from my time working with David is that he was on a plane once, and the person next to him was making basically really good next action lists. He assumed they'd read the GTD book, and they hadn't. This was kind of the only person I think he'd ever come across who kind of invented or reinvented the concept of next actions entirely on his own. When he dug into asking this person about what they did, they were in the field of researching the psychology of extremely high-stress situations. High-stress situations such as exploring the Arctic and being out of contact with others for days and days on end. High-stress situations such as maintaining a satellite out in space, right? And the yawning void of space behind you. And if you mess up and, turn that bolt half a turn instead of a quarter turn, you may not be coming back to Earth. What he found is that the brain needs absolutely bite-sized actions in that kind of high-stress environment and very clear sequences and steps in order to be able to perform these tasks under duress. And of course, what he realized, what I realize now, is that if that's how the brain works optimally, even under the most difficult of circumstances, then obviously that's an optimal way to deal with all kinds of other circumstances. Your brain wants to know what's next. What's next? What are my options? What can I do? And that is where the contexts come in. Where are you? What do you have available to you? How are you doing? Those are keys to understanding what a good context is. And as you can see, very, very different than finance or blue or any of these other sort of artificial categories we might want to impose on those things we need to get done. So if you watched this far, you're probably now bought into the idea that, yeah, okay, at least I'm willing to try using context for next actions as a way of organizing things and in terms of deciding what I need to get done. How do I get started? What does this mean in practical terms? Well, the first and probably biggest thing you need to do is make sure that you're doing what we call a weekly review involving looking at those projects, those multi-step outcomes, those finish lines, those long-term things in relation to the very next steps that you're going to take. And in there, you need to trust that once a week, if you really look at all that, if you really make sure for every project there is a next action, if you really are reviewing the project level to understand your priorities, that you are going to be earning the right to comfortably live day to day in a set of lists that really involve bite-sized next actions. That you really can trust that by looking at it all once a week, rather than day by day sifting through your projects and actions, and all of these kind of artificial categories, you will be able to streamline your whole approach. You will be able to once a week really look at it all, understand it all, and prepare your future self, prepare your future brain to be able to tick off those next actions no matter how difficult or stressful or strange the week becomes for you. The next thing is that if you're currently working from your projects lists day to day, and particularly if those projects, as it were, are really more like topics or themes, first of all, you need to make those into good finish line statements. What does done look like? Your brain wants to know, and it wants to review that regularly to orientate you toward actually getting the stuff done, rather than continually looking at blue or finance. Again, it doesn't necessarily help all that much to have to rethink what the finish line means each time. Next, you want to look at your action context. Look at it at least once a day at the start of the day for those contexts where you're actually going to be doing things throughout the day. At least once a day. If you've been looking at projects and going project action, give yourself the luxury of trying actions by context. See what that does for you. And if those contexts are actually artificial categories, right? If they don't make sense to you, think about what does make practical sense. Where are you throughout the day? What's your energy levels like in terms of how they fluctuate? What do you have available to you as resources? And those kind of things will start to shape lists that make actual sense to your brain in terms of what's possible and what the options are to actually get stuff done. In this day and age, we really can't afford artificial and external models imposed on us from the outside to try and tell us what we ought to be doing. We have to get real. And your brain really wants to help you. It really wants to get stuff done. It really wants to get the right stuff done. But in the end of the day, it needs your help. Give it the right next steps in the right kind of contexts where it can understand what's possible and what its options are. Review the bigger picture. Don't review it all the time. Review it about once a week to get your marching orders straight. And then watch your stress levels start to drop and your productivity soar. I've seen it work for so many people, but it does take a bit of faith. It does take a bit of a shift away from this model of let's make up a bunch of categories to let's get really real about what the contexts are for you, where you work and how you get stuff done. I hope this was useful to you. If so, do be sure to subscribe and you'll get this from me and all of my wonderful colleagues, a lot more thinking about how you can stay productive in these times. From me until next time, thanks for tuning in and see you soon.